The Destiny 2 beta was a very primitive version of the game that's almost unrecognizable to what we have now. This was the first time Destiny 2 was ever playable to the public, and it had very mixed reactions for reasons I'll explain in this video. I actually still have tons of footage from the beta, and I found some pretty interesting stuff when I was digging through it all, so this is going to be another time capsule and trip down memory lane at this very unique point in the game's infancy. Most of you probably remember that Destiny 2 launched in quite a rough state, to say the least, and the beta was the first look at some of those decisions that would then get U-turned over the next year. So there's a lot of weird stuff in this that you might not recognize. As far as the content available, you had one story mission, Homecoming, which was the first one where the tower gets blown up. Probably one of Destiny's best missions to date. There was also the inverted Spire Strike, and then for Crucible you had Control on Endless Vale and the new Countdown mode on Midtown, which is more competitive. You also had the 6 original subclasses. This was before we knew they had the 3rd Taken King subclasses, and they were kind of a surprise later on. Then you had a bunch of fixed legendary gear, and as well as that 3 class exclusive exotics. So Risk Runner for the Warlock, Sweet Business for the Titan, and Sunshot for the Hunter. This was because there was no vault or way to transfer gear, so these exotics were basically fixed to each class, and you had to play them to play with the exotics. Now, the most interesting thing is that the Destiny 2 beta was actually a lot smaller than the Destiny 1 beta and got a fair bit of criticism because there wasn't really enough to do. So the Destiny 1 beta was a lot more like a demo. It had kind of the opposite complaint, where it actually had a giant portion of the final game and also ran for 10 days, nearly double the planned time of the Destiny 2 beta. As far as content, it's pretty funny because instead of 1 mission, it had 5 story missions, which is almost like a fifth of the final game's campaign, but we didn't really know it at the time. It also had the classic Devil's Lair Strike, as well as the whole tower and vendors. It also had Earth Patrol, which was a lot, so all the patrol missions and public events and stuff to explore on there. And then for Crucible, you had Control on 2 maps, and there was even Iron Banner as well running with 2 more maps and Iron Banner ranks and rewards and loot. And then to top it off, on the final day, they even added the first moon mission as a surprise. So there was a ton to do. It also had progression, so you could rank up to the level 8 cap and earn gear and get engrams. Whereas for Destiny 2, you of course had pre-selected gear with no random rolls. Everything was fixed, which definitely limited the loot pool. So you would basically earn clones of what you already have, and a few armor sets that looked a bit different but were basically cosmetic. As far as progression, everyone was at a fixed level 20 with 200 lights, so there was no way to level up or upgrade anything, and the entire progression element that pretty much makes Destiny fun wasn't there, and it was pretty noticeable. Destiny 1 also had an alpha the month before the beta, which was PlayStation exclusive, so that had even more time to play, and obviously this was a brand new game at the time, so everything was new and fun. But it was funny, many said that Destiny 1 revealed way too much content before launch, and Destiny 2, they had the opposite problem, and a lot of people were expecting this mountain of content like D1 and then quickly ran out of things to do. So those are the main differences as far as the overall content, but despite this, the content in the Destiny 2 beta was still very polished and very well received overall. And definitely one of the highlights and best bits, which we'll talk about next, was this special event in this long forgotten place you might remember called The Farm. But first, I need to tell you guys about one of the most downloaded mobile games of all time. It's got PvE, PvP, bosses, loot, a deep backstory, and is completely free. Of course, we're talking about Raid Shadow Legends, who kindly sponsored this video. I'm sure you've heard of it, but if you haven't, then all new players that use my link or this QR code will get $30 worth of free stuff instantly to your account. One of my favorite characters from the High Elves faction would be the Royal Guard. He's basically a boss destroyer because his damage scales based on the enemy's HP and also decreases enemies' defense and can hit 4 times in a row. As an example of the game's backstory, the High Elves faction have been around for thousands of years and even survived a Lizard Man empire. Apparently there are also Dark Elves who got corrupted and caused a brutal civil war they ended up losing, so there's a lot going on in the story. Raid also just released a new faction, the Sylvan Watchers, with a bunch of new champions as well as new events in the season of the Forge Pass with some of the most powerful gear in the game's history. Also, if you're an Amazon Prime member, you can now get even more exclusive rewards, so click the link in the description or scan this QR code to install Raid for free and get $30 worth of bonuses immediately to your account, and that will be found here in the chest icon. Now, by far one of the most interesting parts of the beta was on the last day they made it so the new farm social space was available for only 1 hour in this kind of special event. So it was empty and there were no vendors or much to interact with, but they did have quite a few secrets and Easter eggs and quite a lot to explore because it was the first time it was ever playable. And this was also one of the cleverest bait and switches Bungie ever pulled off. They acted like this would be the new tower and the only main social space, and then at launch, when you beat the campaign, it turns out there was this whole new tower, the one we have now, which they kept secret. So that was very impressive. I remember at the time people were pretty satisfied with the farm. It was cool, not really a good enough replacement for the tower, but the farm was still very refreshing. It was a cool different space, very naturey, very open, very chill. It did have an upgraded capacity of 26 players instead of the usual 16 in Destiny 1's tower. There was this weird secret room behind the Cryptarch. If you kind of crouched and went through the curtain, there was this unfinished textured room, which I don't think was intended to be there, but it was a kind of random thing to find. Probably the most notable thing was the football field. This was actually fully functional with goals, and fireworks would go off when you score. And this was kind of an upgrade to the tower ball in the Destiny 1 tower, but this time it was a fully functional and interactive game you could play, which is really cool. Now, unlike Destiny 1, there was no patrol zone, so you couldn't actually explore PvE, but what you could do as a workaround, which most of us did, was just load up the inverted spire strike with friends and just not do it and go explore Nessus instead. And this was actually pretty fun, and there was a decent amount to go and see. Even in this small space, it wasn't the entirety of Nessus. There were these giant barricades they had put, which kind of blocked off most of the rest of Nessus, but the space you did have was pretty big. But definitely the most fun thing to do was the infinite super glitch. So this was one of the biggest criticisms about the Destiny 2 beta, was the abilities were super slow. It took like a year to earn your super. If you waited long enough, the dregs with pikes would spawn, and if you basically popped your super at the same time as hopping on the pike and got your timing perfectly, then you could go to your inventory and switch back to a weapon, and that would give you an infinite super, which is definitely one of the best ways to try out the new supers. It was actually a lot of fun. So with this, you could lob Infinite Dawnblaze, which is probably the best one, and then there's also the Sentinel Shield, which you could throw and also melee and block with. And the Arctrider was definitely the weakest because you basically could only attack up close, and it was very easy to die with it. You didn't have extra health, so this was definitely one of the most popular things to do in the beta. The Homecoming story mission definitely went down very well. It had been shown off a million times before in the reveal events and trailers and demos, but it was easily one of the best missions in Destiny. Some reviewers did criticize how it did somewhat overset expectations and make it seem as if every mission would be like this and as long. I'd still say the entire Destiny 2 campaign and the Red War was top tier. It was one of the best campaigns and miles better than Destiny 1. The inverted spire strike was pretty cool, but again, it had been seen a million times before in lots of previews and trailers, so it wasn't that new and exciting, but still getting to play PvE and getting to try out everything, the new subclasses and weapons, was definitely what made it. Now, as far as the Crucible and the rest of the game, this was definitely where a lot of those red flags did sink in. Now, a month before this, Luke Smith had actually announced that Destiny 2 would have no random rolls, and they said they had some sort of plan they were working on to try and make loot unique, but that never happened, and then they just added random rolls in Forsaken a year later. But these were some warning signs that some of this stuff in the loot system and progression just wasn't going to work in the full game. Some of the biggest differences were, of course, those double primaries, so basically 2 primary weapons in your primary and energy slot, and pretty much a special weapon in your heavy slot. It massively nerfed players, mainly in PvE, but also quite noticeable in PvP. A part of it was nice because obviously power ammo was a lot more special, so snipers and shotguns were a lot more rare, which was the main reason they did it, because that was a huge problem in Destiny 1. But that then created a different problem of just loads of primary weapons, which were very, very weak, as well as massively increased Guardian health. It made it a team shot fest, so there were just lots of primary weapons, and that was the biggest complaint you will hear everyone talk about, was the team shotting in the beta. This is also back when it took 3 melees to kill someone on full health, which was crazy at the time, so it was a very different Crucible, and just is weird to even look at this footage, and it seemed a bit too early to judge just off a beta with very little content, but it did seem like a lot of this stuff probably wasn't going to work, and of course it didn't really turn out too well in the final launch, but of course Bungie would then go on to fix most of this stuff. One of the cool things was that if you played the beta, you got this exclusive emblem, which you might still see some players rocking today, so this of course is very, very rare and can't be obtained anymore. On the last day of the beta, they did also announce they would be extending it by another 2 days, which was pretty cool, but it wasn't exactly groundbreaking, as like I said, most players had done everything after a few days, but Bungie mainly did it to stress test these servers and even tweeted that connections will be extra choppy and try and do your part by getting kicked to orbit, so it was a lot more unstable, but definitely nice to have an extra 2 days added. Now, definitely one of the best and most well-received parts of the beta was actually the PC beta. Now, this, of course, was the first time Destiny was ever playable on PC, so it actually went down basically perfectly and unanimously everyone loved it. Same content, just much better graphics. Now, there were a few people disappointed by Destiny 2 from this beta because they thought it looked a bit too similar to Destiny 1 and almost like a DLC. There wasn't enough change, which to be fair, I understand because sometimes sequels are completely different in a whole different game, but realistically, that was never going to be the case for Destiny, especially if you consider that Bungie only had 2 or 3 years to make this game while still maintaining and making DLCs for Destiny 1 in parallel. A lot of Bungie devs have admitted since in recent years that they didn't actually want to make a sequel in the first place, and they kind of had to because of the Activision contract to pump out lots of different games in a similar Call of Duty model. So the point with Destiny 2 wasn't to make an entirely different new game that's a complete departure. It was meant to be basically like an upgrade of Destiny 1, also on PC with a new engine. So this was basically an upgrade. Now, we all love Destiny 1, but it wasn't all perfect. So if you want to see 23 reasons why that was the case, you can click on this very controversial video. But hopefully you enjoyed this one. Of course, a like rating is appreciated if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.